everybody. Welcome to week 4 of the Portal Quilt Sewalong. I hope you guys are doing okay. I've been thinking about everybody this week. It's been another surreal week in our world, and everybody here's doing okay. I've got my son and my daughter and my husband, all 4 of us, and we really haven't left our little block really in going on 4 weeks now, so it's quite surreal. I think the furthest away I've been is to the post office, and I love those little trips, but I'm always kind of anxious to get back home too. We're doing okay. We are introverts by nature, so we're doing okay, but I hope you are too. I'm thinking about you, but I hope you're finding some creative escape in our Portal Quilt. We're finishing up the individual blocks this week. We're going to be sewing on the centers of the block. Today in this video, I'm going to show you 2 different ways to do that. I'm also going to show you how I laid out my blocks on my design wall and talk through some tips. There's really not many tips as far as like laying out the design. The ones that come to mind for me that are most important, don't overthink it. Put your blocks up without thinking, oh, I need to put this one here and this one here. I want you to lay them all out, not even thinking about placement. And the reason I tell people to do that, and people in my workshops will kind of do that, and then they'll kind of say, well, but I really don't want those 2 right there together. Those are the decisions that you evaluate after you've laid everything out. Because what happens is that you discover some interesting color combinations and some interesting side-by-side color accents that appear when you just lay it out first and then go back and tweak your design. But let's get started. Laid this one out kind of how I think it's gonna end up being. I might make a couple changes, but what I've done is I've laid out, this is the throw size, so it's 5 across and 6 down, and I've laid out my blocks, making sure that the darker values are always on the sides and the lighter values within the same block are the top and the bottom. And what I like about that is I like that it creates a little bit of consistency. These patterns in these fabrics by August Wren are very similar in value. They're also very busy. There's a lot of visual texture. So it's nice to have some consistent elements within the design that sort of make it work, even within a super scrappy looking quilt. So I like the way that it creates some darker value areas going across the quilt and some lighter value areas going up and down. The last part was when I laid the blocks out on the design wall, then I went back in and started placing my center squares. You don't have to be super crazy about how you do this. Go by instinct, lay them out, lay out the center squares instinctively to begin with, make quick decisions and things like that. Then go back and edit and change a little bit, but don't think too hard on it, because in the end, it's gonna look good no matter what. One thing that I found that I liked when I was laying out the center squares that I did not know was that I liked having this green And you may remember from a couple weeks ago, this was one of the ones that I was like, well, I'll make a couple of center squares and test out whether I like it as a center square, because this fabric is not used in any of the blocks. There's 2 greens in the collection that I have. And so I chose this one with the brighter green inside of the pattern for the blocks, and sort of pulled this one aside and thought maybe I'll use it in the center block. So I liked the way it looked. So I cut out 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks, and I just made sure that they weren't super close to the squares that had green. And the only reason I did that really was just to spread the green spots visually in the quilt, just to spread them out. The same with the darker squares. I was thinking that a square like this, which doesn't have a huge amount of visual contrast, may benefit from one of the darker squares. I actually liked the slightly lighter square better for some reason once I laid it all out. So these are all decisions that you can mull over once you have it all laid out, but really don't overthink it too much. Canvas one that I am making a version of. I'm using the fat quarter set. So I'm going to show you what I think I'm going to do to put these centers onto this. Now, canvas is a little bit heavier than quilting weight cotton, so for that reason, this one's going to be the one that I machine stitch these squares on to. I'm going to needle turn applique the other version I'm doing, so I'll show you how to do that on that one. I've chosen my center. Here's my finished square. So what I need to do, I'm going to machine applique this to the center. And so I'm going to need to turn back 1/4 inch on all 4 sides. Now the way I do that, because I like super straight edges, is making sure that your iron is on. I take a ruler and I line up my 1/4 inch mark at the edge, and I take a Hera marker. If you have one of these, it's great. If you don't, you can also just draw a line with a pencil, just something that you can see. But I love using a Hera marker because it will crease it. I have a few of these in my shop if you want one. I'll link to it below, but I'm going to show you how I use a Hera marker. So I just take the thinnest edge, this here, and I'm just going to run it against the ruler on the back here. And I don't know if you can actually see that, but there's a slight crease there. And what happens is when I go to the iron and I crease that, it creases really nicely. So I just do that to all 4 sides. Might want to do, you have to kind of bear down just a little bit, so it's good if you do it on your cutting mat for this particular marking. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Hera marker, it doesn't leave a mark, it leaves a crease. There's no chalk or anything here, it leaves just a crease. All right, so now I'm going to take this, I've made my 4 creases on the back, and now I'm going to take this to the iron and crease, fold it in and press it so that those stay nice and flat. All right, so now you can see I've pressed all 4 sides in. So now this is what it looks like on the outside. So now you need to center it on your block, and that's pretty easy to do. I just fold the block in half, wrong sides together, and just sort of like press a crease on there. I fold it together on the opposite side, and finger press a crease on there. So I don't know if you can see that, but I've got a line going through the center. I'm going to do the same thing with this guy. These are just little temporary marks just to keep us straight. And so now I'm going to line up this line here, this crease on the block, the crease on the center, and then do the same thing here. And then I'm just going to pin that in place. That's good to go. Do this exact same thing to all of these blocks to get them ready to machine stitch. All right, so I've got my center square 1/4 inch turned over. I've got it pinned down pretty well. I would suggest if you have something like a seam ripper or something that can help hold your piece in place as you sew, it's really easier to do that than to just add a bunch of pins. So I'll show you how I do that. So I'm going to be stitching along the edge. You could go in a 1/4 inch, but I'm going to do kind of a scant 1/4 inch because I want to make sure that I catch the turned under edge nicely. When you're top stitching, at least on my machine, I make it just a tiny bit longer. Not much, just it looks better. So I'm going to take a couple stitches and back stitch. And then trying to stay straight. Here's my seam ripper. I'm just looking ahead at where my needle is going to be going, making sure everything's turned under. A little bit of dust there. And then I'm going to get to the corner and pivot with my needle in the down position. That's one thing. If you can put your needle in the down position for sewing these on, it's much easier. I need to do one more stitch. There we go. And then I'm looking ahead. Take your pins out, don't sew over your pins. Just holding it down with the edge of my seam ripper. And then I'm pivoting, just sort of making sure this side is nice and smooth. I'm using matching thread, so if it's not exactly perfect seams, that's okay. And I'm on the home stretch here. Just gonna walk it to where it will meet that next line of stitching where I started. And there you have it. I'll trim my threads. And that's what it looks like. So now let's talk about the other version, which is hand sewn on. So I am going to hand sew the centers to the other version of the quilt that I'm doing with this scrappier look. A couple things you need for this. I again use my hair marker. You can also use a chalk pencil to mark your 1/4 inch line. You need some thread that is the color of the square that you're adding on. You need some thread snips or some scissors, and the type of needles that I use to do this type of applique, which is called needle turn applique, is Clover Gold Eye number 9 needles. I sell these in my shop. The reason I like these is because they're long enough for me to actually sweep the fabric under the square as I'm stitching, and I'll show you what I mean, but they don't leave a large hole, but it's not so tiny that I can't see it because my eyesight is terrible. So these are in my shop. I'll put a link to it. need to press this at the iron, I just finger press this. I go around and I press at the crease line from the front. It just sort of helps give that little crease some extra memory so that when I'm sewing it down, it makes a nice clean edge. And if you've never done needle turn applique before, this is a great project to learn on. It's super simple. There's no curves, it's all straight lines. So it's a good one to try on. I encourage you to try it. It's great to do in front of the TV. So now I'm just going to fold this in half both ways and finger press just my center lines. And then I'm going to take the block and do the exact same thing. I'm going to find the center and just extend and mark that line with the finger crease. And one thing I always tell people to do when you're marking these is to please wash your hands first, because it's amazing. You can easily discolor your fabric at the crease line if you're not careful. So now I'm going to line up the lines, pins through the outside, because I'm going to show you how I do this. So then I take a piece of thread from my spool, and keep your thread about the length from the inside of your elbow to your fingertips. That's about as long as you ever want your thread. And I make a knot at the end. I'm just using one strand of thread, not a double strand. So I'm going to start like midway here. You don't ever want to start on a corner. And if at all possible, you don't want to end your thread on a corner. You'd want to end it before. But let's start sort of like right in here. And I'm going to just bring my needle up right at that crease line and just through the top layer of fabric. So it looks just like that from behind. So I'm going to bring it up, and the first thing I'm going to do is gently crease that back down at that crease line and just sort of hold it in place. And you're taking tiny little blind stitches, and you're sticking your needle down through both layers, sort of almost like right behind where you just came up, and then you're coming out right at the fold line. So your goal, I should be stitching this in a contrasting color so that you can see, but your goal is that you really don't even see that. So I'm going to make a few stitches, and then what I'll do is try to make some in a contrasting stitch so that you can see what I'm doing. Alright, so let's get some bright thread. Need some neon pink thread. And a little tip when you're threading your needle, you always want to thread your needle from the cut side, not the side that you pull off of the spool first. You want to do it from the cut side, because the eyes of these needles are small, and there's a reason why, because it'll make a small hole. Here we have my line. I'm going to come out again right at the fold of the top layer to begin. Tuck that little knot under, and then we're gonna make a few stitches. You want these very close together. Once you start, you'll kind of get a rhythm. It'll take a little bit, but I find this type of stitching really enjoyable, because even though it's a little bit tedious, you're really not having to count anything. You're kind of shaping a piece of fabric onto another piece of fabric as you go. Oops. The goal is to not be able to see those stitches at all. And let me show you what happens when you get to a corner. So I'm coming up on this corner. My next crease is right here. So the stitch I just took is right at the very top of that crease. So I'm going to do a quarter turn, and I'm going to take my needle, take my needle, and I'm going to just gently just sweep this whole corner underneath. It's going to be a little clunky, but then you take your thread, you pull it back out just a little bit, and it kind of straightens out that point. So it may take a little bit of time, may take a couple times of practice, but you'll get it. And then what you want to do before you continue on to the next side is you want to take one little stitch right at that corner to hold it in place. So now I'm ready to just sort of continue on. I'm going to hold this side and stitch along here in the same way. And whenever you come across like a little thread or something that's sticking out, you use your needle to just sweep it under and behind the square. Decide that you want to trim away the back portion of this to just release some of that bulk, then to do that you just want to make sure that you have separated the front and the back. Make a little clip in the back and just carefully trim everything to just a 1/4 inch from that stitching line. So now I've trimmed away the back, and all that does is that makes the entire front of the piece lay a little bit flatter. So that is your choice. So that's it for this week. Get your centers onto your blocks, and we will be sewing the blocks together next week. Next week is week 5. Be sure and share all of your progress online on Instagram. Tag me at Blair S. And be sure and use the hashtag wisecraftportal. We're posting images from everyone. Thank you all so much for everyone who's posted. We really enjoy seeing everything that you're doing. Until next week, take care and happy sewing.